That is usually whenever I stand up and talk and lecture, I'm talking about something where I'm sure that I know what I think. And I'm also arrogant enough that when I'm sure I know what I think, I'm also pretty close to being absolutely sure that I am right, that I understand the situation, that I understand what's going on. And thus I regard my task as that of shedding light into dark corners, of bringing enlightenment to an audience. And that's not the case here. Here I genuinely don't know what I think. And I'm looking for enlightenment, rather than, say, trying to spread it. So where should I start? I suppose a good place to start is with the presidential election of 1992. When, thanks to Ross Perot's splitting the relatively right-of-center electorate, Bill Clinton rolls into office with 43% of the nationwide popular vote and takes the head of the U.S. government at the head of an extraordinarily fractured and querulous Democratic coalition, which has relatively little respect for him. That is, the Democratic congressional barons regarding themselves as much smarter and wiser and more experienced than this guy from Arkansas who they hadn't heard of 2 years ago, and unwilling to give him much deference. You can say what you want about Bill Clinton. You have to start with the jokes about the zipper problem. But I think he played a weak hand extraordinarily skillfully during his time as president. And during his first year in office, he did two things. He did a grand budget that finally put the U.S. budget deficit created by Ronald Reagan on a downward trajectory. And in the process did a bunch of good things, the expansion of the earned income tax credit to move a bunch more money to people who were relatively poor in America, and so forth. And he did NAFTA. He made the second priority of his first year in office to be to pick up the threads that George H.W. Bush and his administration had left behind, and to push through this North American free trade agreement that George H.W. Bush and company had negotiated. But at the time, there was great questioning as to whether this was the right course to take. That is, the first of Clinton's priorities, the budget, was with some extra bells and whistles in a, say, redistributive direction to equalize income a bit, was with some bells and whistles to equalize income, but mostly it was an Eisenhower Republican priority, kind of sound finance. And for his second initiative, rather than pick something out of the genuinely long list of Democratic initiatives lying fallow, Bob Reich's Labor Department proposals to put serious money into making it easier for people to find jobs, a welfare reform proposal that would actually have focused serious money on helping train people for work, rather than just telling them that they ought to get jobs and assuring them that the market would provide. Rather than doing either of these, Clinton chose another Republican or semi-Republican priority, free trade. In this case, free trade with Mexico. And there were lots of powerful reasons why Clinton chose this for his second initiative. One of them being he thought he could get it passed. Well, it was not at all clear he could assemble a coalition for welfare reform or health care reform in the fall of 1992. But at the time, it was a matter of great concern over whether this was the right thing to do, whether this was going to work, and if so, what its impact on the future of North America would be. And so that's where I got interested in NAFTA, seriously interested in NAFTA, because I spent a good part of 3 months of my life doing analytical support for the effort to persuade the Congress to pass and ratify NAFTA. And in the process saw lots and lots of arguments, made lots and lots of predictions about the way the future was going, and now it's time to take a look back and see what did the thing actually do. And the answer is that I'm really unsure. Now, if you'd asked me 6 years ago, if you'd asked me in 2000, I would then have been ready to conclude that NAFTA was a major success. The key argument in favor of NAFTA had always been that it was the most promising road open to raise the chances for Mexican development, to increase the odds that Mexico would become democratic and prosperous. And that even though NAFTA had been associated with yet another peso crisis, I would have said 6 years ago that the effects of NAFTA had been in the direction of helping Mexican development, and thus that the U.S. was actually performed its neighborly duty to try to help Mexico develop economically, and also politically and socially, and also that it had been a good deal for the United States because a Mexico that is better off is a very good thing for the United States. It's much better to have prosperous, democratic, relatively wealthy, and socially calm neighbors than the reverse. And 6 years ago, I'd have pointed to the fact that even though there had been yet another peso crisis, that even though Mexico's late 1990s had been relatively rough, I would have pointed to the fact that exports had boomed, that NAFTA had done its job making Mexico a nice place to produce in order to serve the world's largest consumer market, and that with guaranteed tariff-free access to the world's largest consumer market, that couldn't help but be a positive step in Mexican development. Now I'm not so sure. That is, exports have boomed, exports have continued to boom. Mexican exports have gone from 10% of Mexican GDP in 1990 to 17% of GDP 6 years ago, to it looks like 28% of GDP today. Next year, Mexico's real exports look like they will be fully 5 times what they were in 1990. Mexico has globalized with a vengeance under NAFTA. But since NAFTA, Mexican real GDP has, as best as we can measure, grown at 3.6 per year. And you might say 3.6% per year is a healthy number, but that's before you've subtracted off Mexican population growth of 2.3% per year, leaving real GDP growth in Mexico to be at 1.3% per year. Slower than the United States, slower than Western Europe. Mexico, in terms of economic prosperity, is further behind the United States now than it was at the start of the 90s, than it was when NAFTA was passed. If you believe that free trade has as its major purpose that of equalizing economies, that of providing the poor with opportunities to successfully emulate the richer, it's not happening. The gap is growing. The way that NAFTA was supposed to work, although it's called the North American Free Trade Agreement, free trade is perhaps, well, the key to NAFTA is not that it would drop tariffs, and not so much that it eliminated quotas. The key to NAFTA was not what it did, but what it kept future Mexican and American governments from doing. When NAFTA was passed, American tariffs on imports from Mexico were very low. But what NAFTA did was that it bound the United States never to raise them again. To the extent that the argument was that lots of potential companies and businesses thought that locating in Mexico to produce for the American market was something that was dangerous, chancy, and dicey, given the possibility that protectionist sentiment could suddenly rise up in the United States again. NAFTA was supposed to bind the United States not to do that, and thus give Mexico a powerful potential edge vis-a-vis other overseas places where you might think of producing for the United States, for example, China. Second, NAFTA was supposed to bind the Mexican government to welcome and to accommodate international investment, to welcome and accommodate investment from abroad. To the extent that there was a great fear that one reason Mexican economic development was relatively slow, right, was because of the populist history of the institutional revolutionary party made lots of first world investors skeptical about the long run value of wealth they could commit to Mexico. the idea that NAFTA would bind Mexico to respect the property of the rich elsewhere that they were putting in Mexico, it was hoped that that would be a powerful incentive to make people boost investment in Mexico and so expand its capital stock, its ability to export, and ultimately its standard of living. So the hope was that with NAFTA guaranteeing Mexican producers tariff and quota-free access to the U.S. market, the largest consumer market in the world, no matter what else happened in U.S. politics, no matter how protectionist the U.S. became vis-a-vis other producers, and with NAFTA also binding the Mexican government to allow foreign investors to earn healthy rates of return, that this would be a potential division of labor bonanza for Mexico. That increasing trade between the U.S. and Mexico would move both countries toward a greater degree of specialization and a finer division of labor in important industries like autos, where labor-intensive portions were increasingly accomplished in Mexico, textiles, with high-tech spinning and weaving done by machines in the U.S., with lower-tech cutting and sewing done elsewhere, and that such efficiency gains from increasing the extent of the market and promoting the division of labor, well, they should have, by the gospel that we economists have preached for nearly 2.5 centuries now, they should have produced rapid growth in Mexican productivity. Likewise, greater efficiency should have been reinforced by a boom in capital formation, which would have accompanied the guarantee that no future wave of protectionism in the U.S. would shut down factories in Mexico, and that no future wave of populism in Mexico would confiscate foreign-owned factories in Mexico. And the key word here is should. Right? Today there are perhaps 100 million Americans with real incomes at purchasing power parities that average perhaps a quarter of the U.S. level, with regional differences stretching from half the U.S. level up in the north down to a tenth of the U.S. level in the south. Mexicans are investing perhaps a fifth of their GDP in capital formation. The capital stock in Mexico is growing at a very healthy rate, and have enormously expanded their integration into the world, or at least the North American economy, here at since NAFTA. But 3.6 rate of growth of GDP, coupled with a 2.3% rate of population increase. The mean income of Mexico today is barely 15% above that of pre-NAFTA days. And because of rising inequality, the overwhelming majority of Mexicans live no better off than their counterparts did 15 years ago. The only part of Mexican development that you can call a great success has been first the enormous expansion of exports, and those who are doing well off of that expansion of exports, which is overwhelmingly not the workers working in the export industries. And the extraordinary rise in incomes and living standards that comes from greatly increased remittances sent back to Mexico from the United States. And for our economists, this is intellectually a great puzzle. Right? We believe in market forces, we believe in the benefits of trade, specialization, and the international division of labor. We think we have seen successful pro-market policies at work in North America and Western Europe over the past 2.25 centuries. We see the enormous increase in Mexican exports to the U.S. over the past decade. We see great strengths in the Mexican economy. A stable macroeconomic environment, fiscal prudence, low inflation, little country risk, a labor force that is increasingly able to move around the country to where the jobs are, a strengthened and solvent banking system, poverty reduction programs that we have at least hope are effective and will be further reformed, high earnings from oil, right, and so forth. Yet what looked to us like successful neoliberal policies, right, what looked to me like successful implementation of policies 6 years ago that would be guaranteed to deliver a genuine boom accompanied by rapidly rising real